Welcome to the 359. I'm Roger Chang.
I'm Joni Salzman.
Google CEO Sundar Pichai appeared before the House of Representatives to talk about, well, all things, but mostly about political bias. He spent 3.5 hours testifying, and we covered all 3.5 hours of it. Anything for you that stood out, Joan?
Google and YouTube have very clear policies. They're clearly defined, and we publish them.
Right.
We know that, but like other than that,
the fact that he said on multiple occasions that there's no political ideology that goes into their algorithms. We thought that maybe this session would be a chance for Congress to kind of delve into a bunch of actually important topics like personal data collection, what's happening in China. And there was some of it, but it felt like it was still dominated by this political bias question.
and when those issues that are more relevant maybe to mainstream consumers, a lot of times it's handled in a really ham-fisted way, like with personal data collection.
Yes.
When congressmen ask about it, they don't realize that Google doesn't make iPhones.
Right there, we're seeing a clip of Congressman Ted Poe holding up his iPhone and like demanding that Sundar Pichai tell him if he could be tracked location-wise if he walks 20 feet across the aisle. Part of the problem and what allowed Sundar to kind of dodge the question was he was holding up an iPhone, which Google doesn't make. And yes, if that phone had Google apps, then yes, his location would be tracked. But Sundar was able to kind of dodge that. And it kind of shows that like when they're asking these questions, they're not being that savvy about it.
Yeah, you need to have very tactical, surgical, smart questions for somebody as smart as Pichai to really answer them. And very few people are on this panel.
And yeah, and not just surgical questions, but be able to follow up with that with a good response. Because I think there were a couple of times where I noticed the representatives had pointed questions that were clearly prepped for them.
Right.
And when Sundar sort of offered up a response, there was no follow-up to it.
Yeah.
Right? There was no way to be critical about it.
That's a good point.
Look, there's a lot back and forth about the political bias. Was it Ted Lieu from California sort of called this a giant waste of time? Basically said if you want positive results, do positive things, which generally that's good advice on life. They should do more positive things. And then, well, I guess some of the stuff that we actually did learn about was a little bit on China, right?
Yeah.
Mostly evaded questions said that there are no plans to launch in China, but we did get some details. More than 100 people had worked on the project at one point.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that when pressed to commit on whether or not they would outright dismiss was it censorship and surveillance of users, he kind of reneged. He just said like we'd be open to engaging with people. He didn't actually say
he wouldn't like make that hard line in the sand, saying that's a line we won't cross.
Yeah, and I just noticed like he kind of he would go back to that line to get away from any questions that were particularly pointed.
Now, do you remember from when Sheryl Sandberg was testifying before Congress? I remember she made a sort of a definitive statement about activities in China. Do you recall what that was?
I don't. But
if I remember it right, it was kind of like the question was posed a little differently. It was like, would you participate in China under the circumstances that exist now? And her answer was no.
Yes.
But that's not how they put it to Sundar.
No, and I think that's how he was able to kind of get out of that question. Yeah. And again, it speaks to the kind of level of tech savvy, right? Like no one really followed up on that. Like, well, you didn't actually answer the question.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was between that and I guess the personal data. It just seemed like we didn't get a lot out of 3.5 hours. Any other surprises for you?
I mean, I agree with Representative Lieu that a lot of it did feel like a big waste of time.
Yeah, and it was a little frustrating because it felt like congressman after congressman who wanted to talk about the political bias thing were like, I know you're saying this stuff, but I don't really believe you.
I'm just going to keep asking.
And I'm going to keep asking you the same question. There were a couple of congressmen that just sort of like shouted in the sky. They didn't ask any questions. They just ranted for their allotted 5 minutes.
Which is always going to happen in these grandstanding sort of hearings. But it's helpful if their grandstanding isn't like butting up against incompetence about the subject matter.
Right. The reality of the situation.
Right.
All right. That's it for us. Thankfully, it's over. For more coverage, check us out on CNET. I'm Roger Chang.
I'm Joni Salzman.
Thanks for listening.
As always, thanks for joining us for the recording of the audio podcast. You can subscribe to us using the links below. Now is the time to go ahead and send in your questions and comments, any of your thoughts and emotional takeaways from today's very in-depth session. But to be honest, a lot of people have a lot of, let's call it clout in this game, being that it is heavily politically charged. Don't hold back. We want to hear what you think. For one, I thought that he was... I'm going to go ahead and take it from my perspective, which is like composition and video playback. So he was more composed than Zuckerberg, and I think they treated him more like an adult that way. I'm going to go ahead and put that one out there.
Yeah, I mean, his responses were definitely more... there was more finesse to it. There was definitely more pose. Like, he clearly prepared for this. And I think Sundar, at least from the interactions I've seen with him in public, I mean, he's just generally a bit more composed. He's like a better public speaker than Zuck is, so there's less of that awkwardness that's inherent with Zuck.
Yeah. Inherent Zuck awkwardness. Sure.
Yeah, he answers the questions the way a
lawyer would really want him to answer them.
Yeah,
most of the
exactly.
time.
Like, he didn't offer up too much information. He kind of knew when to dodge. When he'd say like, "Oh, I'll get back to you," or "I'll have my team get back to you."
Yeah.
He's always very polite.
Yeah.
It never got too contentious.
There was that one that one exchange where it kind of was the most tense. You remember near like
the notion of the Latino voter movement.
Right.
Like, basically, one of the representatives had asked about, I think it was Representative Jordan, who asked about
Correct, yeah.
the issue of getting the Latino vote out in these three states.
3 key states.
In three key states.
Was wording from an email by a Google employee.
Yes, who's like, as you pointed out, probably having the worst day ever right now. That's like the last thing you want to do is have your name appear in that context during a congressional hearing. The idea that like, we got folks out, we changed the algorithms, we added new features to allow voters to either get to the polls easier or actually paid for some of the transportation in these three key states. And like the representative made the point, like taking out those 3 words, like everything else seemed fine. It was good corporate citizenship. But then when you are being selective about what states you're going after, that's when you kind of get in trouble.
It implies the possibility that person had political bias.
Yes, yeah. And Sundar, like, he was fairly quick to deny that this was a Google thing.
But it was the moment where he was the least composed, where he struggled the most to come up with a way to answer it that felt safe.
I know I would probably have struggled there.
I definitely think his the least composed moment was Poe, when he couldn't even fathom how to answer that question. And to be fair, neither could I.
Well, he knew how to answer, just not without being insulting.
The iPhone question?
Yeah.
If I walk 20 feet over here, does Google know I walked 20 feet over here?
He definitely knew the answer to that question, but the fact that he held up his iPhone definitely gave him, it opened the door for him just basically say, like, I don't know. I mean, it's an iPhone. It's not one of our things. I mean, realistically, yes. If he had Google Maps, if he had Gmail, any number of Google services,
which are basically ubiquitous on almost every phone.
I mean, you can't assume because technically they're not default. You'd have to install these phones. At least one of the representatives said she didn't have any apps on her phone. So
I think that was a rhetorical or theoretical question.
Yeah,
if I
maybe
didn't.
I don't. I can't really. I don't want to assume with any of these representatives. But like if so technically he like was in the right to say like I can't really answer. Because, you're in your testimony, you don't want to make that assumption. That's what a lawyer would tell you.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, he did the right thing, but also the fact that Poe holding up that iPhone just definitely it let him dance around the topic.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Honestly, there were a lot of really good questions and commentary coming from the aisle today, from a few candidates whose names are all kind of blending together in my head right now.
Yeah.
But there really were some fantastic grilling questions that need to be addressed. But at the other side of it, there was just a whole myriad of grumpy grandstanding.
Yeah, there was the one in particular. I mean, there's a couple, but the stuff about the political bias and then the questioning of Google staffers for their political bias was kind of pointing to me like it seemed like I think it was Representative King who I think had asked basically for Google to start investigating their employees for political bias. Which, how do you do that as a company? Do you like you can't. I mean, like
I think it's illegal.
There are literally laws against that. So I don't really know how that would have worked. And like, I think Congress sort of wants, like, part of Congress basically wants Google to be this completely sterile, non-political entity, but it's made up of human beings.
Well, then they need to sterilize the entire world. They need to sterilize
Exactly.
society because
they're made up of people. People have their opinions. They're they're
they're
right.
going to use Google, and those opinions are going to rub off essentially.
Right.
Google should be sterilized, but the search results that it returns should not be sterilized at all in any way, especially if they have an anti-conservative bias.
There you go. That was
kind of the argument.
The takeaway. Yeah.
Like, we love free speech in our search results. We don't love free speech at Google itself.
Yeah.
Right.
As long as
For
it doesn't
some.
interfere with my own personal views and perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Free speech is great when you agree
Yeah,
with
some
me.
of those
Yeah.
some of the questions were being asked, like, why are all these negative search results coming?
I know.
Like, I'm like, well, I mean,
There's
if you
such a
look,
good answer
if
for
you
that.
look, I know, like, obviously Sundar couldn't say, but if you like look at just sort of the tenor and like how these things are looked at objectively, like, there's some, argument made that negative coverage is warranted.
Honestly, I was kind of hoping right there that Sundar was going to launch into a 2-hour tutorial on how cookies work.
Well, he did go through a definition of like going to the Trump idiot thing, where someone had asked why Trump and idiot are so linked together in SEO, and
Because trolling.
no, it's essentially it's Google bombing, right? There are folks
Yeah.
out there who can manipulate search results by flooding the zone with idiot posts linked to Trump, and that will alter the SEO. So Trump and idiot come up together.
Yeah, and that shouldn't necessarily be on the Google people. Be like, we're not responsible for that.
Right, exactly. That's what the public feedback is.
It always floors me, like, I'm trying to come up with a good analogy where, like, okay, so if a drug dealer transports some like crack cocaine or something like that to
I
somebody,
already love this analogy.
and then that person who uses it dies, is the taxi at fault? Like,
Right.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I'm working through it.
Yeah. I can see that.
the vehicle for terrible people should not be held accountable for
But
terrible people.
I do feel like there is validity to the argument that if Google is susceptible and exposed to being gamed in that way, it has a responsibility to fix the loopholes that allow it to be gamed. Like if it's if their mission is to return accurate and personally relevant information, then and there's ways that people can make sure that they aren't, then they need to fix that problem.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. But then somebody's just going to find another way to poke a different hole in it.
Yeah.
And it's just an
True.
ongoing...
But I mean, if Google doesn't do anything, then they're just as complicit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There has to be a good faith attempt, at least, to make sure all this stuff is unbiased and objective.
Yeah.
Although, to your taxi analogy, if the cab driver took extra money and like continued to take extra money, then they would be liable.
That's a good point. Fair enough. Fair enough.
So, I mean, no, to that analogy, like if Google continues to profit from all the added engagement from negative content, then they're just as complicit.
So knee-jerk takeaway today, how much was theater, how much was legitimate?
Oh,
I mean, it's like mostly theater.
like 99% theater.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty high up there. Like I said, I thought some of the stuff from China was interesting, and like I think we got like the tip of the iceberg on a smart discussion about personal data collection, but we weren't really there. I mean, so much of it was so dominated by the political bias stuff, and again, it's sort of a back and forth, right? Like Google says there aren't, and then Congress says we don't believe you, and it's that for like 3 hours. So
Yeah.
that was kind of what was frustrating about this process, because this really could have been an opportunity to talk about some of the real problems that Google faces. It just ended up being not about that.
Yeah, like I think it would have been really interesting if someone, like for example, Sundar Pichai said when there was a discussion of conspiracy theories on YouTube, he said like, it's something that we need to work better on. You have to keep in mind we get 400 hours of content uploaded every minute. A great question I wish that someone would ask is, are you too big to even handle the responsibility that you have? Like, have you created something that you cannot control, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah.
I would love to hear what his answer to that is, because I don't know.
Yeah. You'd have to ask his lawyers. I'm sure he doesn't know either. He has to get prepped for it.
Either way, a good day to be Alta Vista, Yahoo, Bing, or DuckDuckGo.
DuckDuckGo.
I don't think it's ever a good day to be Bing. Just saying that out there.
All right, fine.
I heard somebody suggest that Monopoly Man was a Bing employee. Was it you? Did she say that?
No,
I'm
not
glad
saying
you mentioned that
was
because Jay Petrie Dunnett is asking, did we see the Monopoly Man?
Yes,
Oh,
we did. We did
did
see
we
him.
ever?
It's making his second cameo. I think he was at the Equifax hearing. There was someone else. Well, who else was there?
At this hearing, Alex
Yeah,
Jones was
Alex
there.
Jones
Yeah.
was he inside? I know he was
I think he was
outside.
inside. He was outside.
Yelling.
I think he was inside for a little while.
Okay.
Of what I picked, I think so from context. Of
Right,
what-
and then there was someone who was kicked out for holding a sign that was like the Google logo mashed up with China.
yeah.
Yeah,
right.
we caught
Yeah,
that.
there
Right.
it is. Yeah.
It was so anticlimactic. I was expecting somebody to be straight up rioting
I
inside the room.
actually thought
Because they're
I
like, the
heard-
police will take him away. It's like,
I
oh.
actually thought there'd be a lot more chaos, but it like ended so quickly that I didn't even have a chance to process it.
I just want to say that China Google Sign Man has a better budget for graphic design than I do.
That's a nice sign, right?
Very nice sign. I was very impressed. It's fantastic typography, solid coloring. A little bit
Yeah.
on the
Oh, yeah.
small side would have been more effective if it was, an oversized banner on a stick. You know how those things work. But hey, that was what I was excited to see.
I could appreciate your respect for sign craftsmanship, Brian.
Before we wrap it up for the day, our Wallop is asking, is there anything that comes out of this congressional hearing? Are there any changes in
great
business
question.
practices?
Yeah. No.
I mean, like in a perfect world, the response would be like if lawmakers were unsatisfied with the answers that they received, then they should craft legislation to fix it.
Yeah.
But I mean,
there were some questions about privacy legislation, and Sundar's already talked about sort of Google's been supportive of it, mostly because they know the writings on the wall and
Yeah.
that this is going to happen.
yeah,
There was at least one, I think only one question on GDPR.
I remember,
which is
yeah, yeah.
surprising.
yeah.
Uh,
And then the
There
question
were a
was, "Are you
couple.
familiar with it?" And he was like, "Yes, we
Yeah.
spent 18 months getting
Yes.
prepared for it."
It's cost us millions of dollars. I'm very aware of GDPR. So in terms of what will come out directly out of this, particularly like the political bias, nothing will come out of this. But
No.
I think in terms of proceeding with the privacy legislation, and I don't know, maybe this inspires more talk about legislation over personal data collection beyond privacy. That could happen too. But like in terms of anything like tangible coming out of this, no. But we'll probably get more of these. I mean, we've had four this year.
Or
Why not have another?
So that was going to be the closing concept, was what is going to be the next step? Do we have anybody else on the chopping block? And what is specifically going to be next for Google after this?
I don't know about who else is on the chopping block,
Yeah.
because they've trotted out the heads of
Yeah.
two heads of Facebook, the head of
Head of
Twitter, now the head of Google,
Yeah. Those, I mean, it's short of getting like Larry Page,
right?
CEO of
Or
Alphabet.
having Apple come, but Apple's in a different sort of
And Apple
universe
right
about
now
that
is
stuff.
sort of viewed a lot more positively.
yeah.
Their stuff's crazy expensive, but right now they're not being accused of dismantling our
Right.
elections or
The scrutiny's mostly around like social media,
Yeah, exactly.
search results, content, and Apple doesn't play in that game quite as much
Right.
as the others. So it's been a little bit
They kind of
isolated.
lucked out.
But we're not going to have a follow-up hearing for Sundar?
I don't know. Well,
I don't know how
it's-
it works.
It's interesting because it was only the House today and the Senate didn't participate. So I'm curious if the Senate gets its turn later, but so far nothing's on the schedule. So
Well, because isn't that how it went for Zuck? He had one and then the other.
exactly right. And so I'm surprised the Senate didn't schedule something the same day or the day after. I'm really hoping it doesn't happen because I don't want to sit through another 3.5 hours of this.
No,
but-
that would be nice, but I don't know. Part of me thinks that maybe we won't see it just because it's not as much of a theater, it's not as much of a circus as trotting out the boy genius,
Yeah, I mean, it is attractive having the CEO of Google, there to answer to your questions.
It is, but it's not as entertaining as watching a bunch of old cronies slap around, little Zuck.
Little Harvard grad, or
Little-
not grad.
little Zucky Zuck.
Harvard dropout.
The
Yeah.
Zuckmeister.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, whatever does happen, stay tuned to CNET because we'll have all the updates.
We will. Plenty of updates for the next couple days. So.
Uh-huh. But we are out of time, though, and thanks for joining us on the late episode today, following up today's scourge of a Congressional House hearing. Reminder, we only have 2 episodes left in the year. That's going to be tomorrow and Thursday at our normal scheduled 11:15 a.m. Eastern time, so hopefully you can join us for that, and then we'll be back for CES the
Yay.
second week of January, right? What is that? January 7th?
Sixth or
6th, 7th?
Seventh.
We'll be coming in from the CNET stage at Tech West this year, and then after that, the 2019 full 359 reboot where I replace everybody with AI robots.
Yes.
So
I
until
mean,
then,
Am I too happy about that?
Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to sleep in the morning, right?
Would be great.
All right, Roger, take us on out of here.
All right, the 359 is available on iTunes, TuneIn, FeedBurner, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Google Podcast, the Amazon Echo, and of course, CNET.com. We will see you all tomorrow.
Take care, folks.
Bye.